Tathalaf Waikalo, Inem Winitwas Atit Watit, Soyapa Winitwas, Tai Simpson, Inwas Nimipu Ayat, Tox he was tots, Laloitza Kina. I have told you in my Indigenous language that my name is the Storyteller. I have told you that my name in English is Tai Simpson, and I've also mentioned that I am a citizen of the Nimipu Nation, or Nez Perce tribe of Idaho. I have also acknowledged that today is a good day, and I'm very happy to be here. Today, we gather virtually on the unceded territory of the Shoshone, Paiute, Bannock, and Yakima Indigenous Nations. Idaho, as we know it, is built on the territory of the Coeur d'Alene, Nez Perce, and Kootenai tribes as well. This is an important piece to my introduction of Heather Dawn Thompson, our keynote on this second day of the Women and Leadership Conference. Within the last 2 years, both of us have given TEDx talks, hers entitled Surviving an Invasion and Understanding Your Neighbors, mine entitled Indigenous Storytelling as a Political Lens. The common thread in each of our talks is our focus on our connections to culture and history. Most importantly, however, is the fact that the parallel between her Plains tribes invasion and occupation is no different than that of Idaho's tribes. And despite occupation and settler colonialism, our Indigenous nations in Idaho and across the country have emerged as storytellers, knowledge keepers, and truly talented leaders, including our keynote today. Heather Dawn Thompson is a beacon in Indian country and within her own Cheyenne River Lakota Nation. She is also a Harvard Law School graduate and an expert in Native American tribal economic development. I am deeply humbled and honored to introduce her as our keynote today. Her address was pre-recorded, but we encourage you to type questions into the chat to be presented to Heather live at the end of her presentation. Not all questions will be addressed, but will be meaningfully put forward in consideration of our time constraints. With gratitude, I pass it to you, Heather.
Tai, thank you very much for that lovely introduction and for the land acknowledgement. Thank you to Boise State University and the Women in Leadership Conference for inviting me to be one of your keynotes. As Tai said, my name is Heather Dawn Thompson. I'm a member of the Cheyenne River Sioux tribe in South Dakota. I live and work in South Dakota. However, I don't even know if the conference organizers knew when they invited me. My parents live in Idaho. My mother, Cleo Dolphus Thompson, was born in South Dakota on the Cheyenne River Sioux Reservation, but she actually graduated here from Payette High School. And my father, Keith Thompson, from Weiser High School. And he spent his entire career with Morrison Knudsen. So while I often have an opportunity to speak publicly, rarely do I get to do so in Idaho and honor my parents. So thank you for this opportunity. So in thinking and reflecting about the Women in Leadership Conference, there's so many unique aspects about women in leadership. Our ability to build teams, our communication skills. The thing that has really been weighing on me recently is empathy, something that is lacking greatly in our national and our local discourse these days, with conversations that are very difficult for a lot of people, from Black Lives Matter to racial inequities to revisiting our history and how we view ourselves, our families, our own nation's history. These can be really hard conversations. And without empathy, we're not able to put each other in one another's shoes and see and view and feel that person's perspective. And that's something that we as women have an opportunity to bring to our local and national discourse right now. I obviously can only speak from my perspective, which is an Indigenous perspective, and that's one I'm hoping to share with you today. Before telling my own story, I wanted to walk us through a hypothetical scenario. Sometimes it's difficult to understand somebody's perspective unless you've thought about it a little bit from your own eyes, from your own perspective. And before we get started, I wanted to pull up a couple words here on the screen. And I think you heard Tai share some of these words in her introduction. And the more you start to read about Indigenous stories and the Native Lives Matter movement, you're going to see words like this: invasion and colonialism, settlers, sovereignty. These words are heavy, but they're very important. And once you have felt this perspective a little bit, it will make more sense. So if you will, use your imagination with me. We're going to talk about an occupation of the United States today. And while at first glance this may seem impossible due to our military might, one thing we have learned, very painfully so in the last couple years, is that we are very vulnerable to cyber attacks. We also have an extremely outdated electric grid infrastructure, and our enemies know that. So what is going to happen is after COVID, the American economy is going to continue to struggle. But more importantly, internationally, we're going to see economic collapse, particularly with China and Russia. The recovery time period is not going to be as soon as people would like. And China and Russia are going to break all diplomatic ties with the United States. You can see here, they're also going to join forces with North Korea, as well as with ISIS. The instability that we've been seeing in the Middle East is going to be exacerbated by what we just saw in Beirut, as well as the growing economic instability there, and it's going to give ISIS the opportunity to reassert itself in power in the Middle East, particularly in Syria. So now with China, Russia, North Korea, and ISIS turning all of their anti-United States cyber attacks on us, they're going to first focus, as you can see here, on our electric grid. As we all know, our infrastructure nationwide, especially our electric grid, is very outdated and it's very vulnerable. They are going to use cyber attacks to take down our entire electric grid. With our electric grid down, that means our communications are down, our banking systems are down, our transportation systems are down. We're incredibly vulnerable. And they're going to take this opportunity to launch EMP attacks, electromagnetic pulses. And what these do is they attack anything that's electronic, our cell phones, our cars, our computers, and our weapon systems. And with these launched throughout the United States, we are so vulnerable, we are so dependent upon electronics and electronic forms of communications and banking and weapons and transportation. This provides them just the opportunity they need to invade. And they are successful. In the spoils of war, Russia, China, and North Korea get access to the very valuable coastal resources in the United States. ISIS, which is of course located in the Middle East and desert country, wants access to our water and to our agrarian resources. So ISIS is allocated Middle America. That means South Dakota, where I'm from, Nebraska, Montana, Wyoming, and Idaho. As we know, anytime you have an occupying force in the history of wars, there's two things that must happen. One, first they have to obtain physical control. But for the long-term control of that, you have to have emotional or mental control of the people who live there. ISIS is, of course, practicing not regular Islam, but an extreme form of Islam, and we can use, based on their past behavior, how they're going to treat us and how the spoils of war for physical control usually go. You can see here under physical control, you first, of course, have to dislocate people. You have to remove them from the territory that you want access to. Then you need access to that property, whether it be to the water resources, the agrarian resources you came for very specific access. Once you have physical control over the people by dislocation, you have to control access to their food. Cannot have independent access to food, else you don't have full physical control over the people. So here in the United States, you can see ISIS creates a series of American camps. They remove us from our homes, and they place us in these camps throughout the United States. You can see there's one here located in Idaho. After we've been removed from our homes and our towns, they then, of course, seize all of our property, with a focus first being on agrarian resources, water resources, minerals. Those resources are reallocated to ISIS, sent back to their homelands, and allocated to Americans who are friendly to ISIS and willing to help them with their occupation. Once we've been placed in these camps and they have physical control over us, they need to destroy our access to food that provides us independence otherwise. So all of our livestock, our cattle, our pigs, our sheep, and most of our wildlife, our deer, are poisoned by ISIS to make sure that we are wholly dependent upon whatever food sources they bring to us in those American camps. After obtaining physical control over us, then they, of course, need to occupy us long term. They're going to need acquiescence. They need to obtain mental control over us. What does that mean? That means our children, our education systems, our religions, our languages. First, all children under 16 are forcibly removed from our homes and the American camps, and they are sent to Syria to attend madras schools, where they are taught only the most extreme form of Islam. They are only allowed to speak Arabic. They are only allowed to study the Quran. And they are taught that everything about being an American, our American values, our parents, our English language, whether it be Christianity or Judaism, everything about us is not only wrong, but we're infidels and we're evil and we're of the devil. Here, back in the American camps, we as women, of course, have to cover completely. We have to cover ourselves in abayas. And all of the business and instructions of the American camps are only provided in Arabic. So we are forced to not practice our religion, not speak our language, and learn Arabic and practice radical Islam in order to obtain the basic instructions we need to live and survive in those American camps. So now that we've walked through this basic hypothetical scenario, we take this moment to pause and reflect and ask ourselves, what would you do? I mean, would you fight? As valiant as that may be, you are guaranteeing the destruction of you, your family, and your family line. Would you run and hide? Go to the hills? We have a lot of outdoor space in South Dakota and Idaho. Do you have that skill set to survive sort of in perpetuity with your family, off-grid? Or do you acquiesce for now? Do you learn Arabic, pretend like you're practicing radical Islam, just tell your kids to go along with it, be safe, survive? Our job is to survive for now. But what about in 10 years? Or 50 years? Or even 100 years? Do you want your children and your grandchildren to remember? Do you want them to remember that they are or were Americans? Do you want them to speak English or Arabic? Do you want them to practice Christianity or Judaism or whatever religion you're currently practicing? Or are you okay with them becoming radically Islamic? Or, as Americans, do you forever resist? Unfortunately, these questions are not that hypothetical. For myself, for my family, for my fellow Native Americans, my colleagues, we actually ask our questions like this to ourselves every single day. If I'm not fluent in Lakota, Malakota, Heather Dawn Thompson, if I'm not fluent, am I somehow betraying all that my grandparents fought for? If my brother wants to practice Christianity instead of traditional Lakota spirituality, is he betraying our great-grandfather who tried to preserve that way of life? If I allow my 10-year-old son to cut his beautiful long braid because he gets mocked and teased in school, am I betraying who he is and his lineage and what he needs to teach to his children? We're going to walk through this same similar hypothetical scenario now, but with real facts from an Indigenous perspective, from the perspective of Native Americans in the United States. The same topics. A U.S. occupation. You have to first obtain physical control and then mental control. Physical control. You have to dislocate the people. You have to move them from where they are so that you can gain access to those resources that you want to. You have to cut off their food so that they cannot have independent food sources. This map here is one that many of us have seen through school, in which it shows the whole dislocation of the Native population throughout the United States to today. I'm going to point out two stories that I think are particularly interesting along these lines. First is the Cherokee and Creek Nations in Oklahoma. As many of us have learned in school about the Trail of Tears. The Cherokee, the Creek, what are known as the 5 civilized tribes, were very successful farmers in Georgia and throughout the Southeast. Their land was extremely valuable. The U.S. Supreme Court upheld that they had the sovereign right to be there. Then President Andrew Jackson disagreed, and he refused to implement the Supreme Court's decision. Instead, he physically removed the Creek and Cherokee nations from Georgia, and he used the United States military, the Army, to remove them and forcibly march them through the Trail of Tears to what was then Indian Territory that's now called Oklahoma. They lost anywhere between 1/3 and half of their population during that forced march on the Trail of Tears. And what's interesting about this story, many of us have heard this story, but how does that relate to us today? Some of you have noticed that there was a Supreme Court decision in the last month called McGirt, and that was specifically on this topic. And the Supreme Court said it might be inconvenient to Oklahoma that now non-natives live there, particularly in the town of Tulsa, etc. But this was the contract. This was the deal that the United States made with the Creek and Cherokee nations. If you let us forcibly relocate you to Indian Territory, to Oklahoma, this will be your land in perpetuity. And that is what the Supreme Court held, that a very significant portion of Oklahoma continues to this day to be Indian Territory. Another example would be up here in South Dakota, where I am from. The Black Hills, many of us are familiar with the Black Hills. There was a treaty signed in 1868, the Fort Laramie Treaty. Interesting to Idaho because that is also the treaty that many of your tribes in southern Idaho are signatories to. But unfortunately, gold was discovered in the Black Hills just a few years after that treaty was signed. And again, non-natives wanted access to that land. This time, it was not the beautiful agrarian land of Georgia, but instead it was the gold and natural resources in the Black Hills. And so the United States government, again, utilized its military, the U.S. Army, to forcibly remove my people, my family, from the Black Hills and place us throughout South Dakota on the reservations that we continue to be located on today. This comes up a lot now today in common conversation because of what's called the Black Hills Settlement. As we know, in 1980, the United States Supreme Court ruled on this very issue. They held that the Black Hills had been taken unconstitutionally from the Great Sioux Nation, or the Lakota, and that they were due to be compensated. That money, however, continues to sit in the United States Treasury. It's now in the trillions of dollars, despite the fact that my tribe and the Great Sioux Nation tribes tend to be the poorest tribes in the United States. That land was sacred and therefore not for sale. And so my tribe has never accepted a single dollar. And it sort of reflects a difference in values. Interestingly, we'll go to one of these other maps that you can see here. I just went back to 1862 and I highlighted Idaho on here as I shared. The Fort Laramie Treaty of 1868 was a very relevant treaty for Idaho as well. Many of your southern tribes, including where Boise is located, are signatories to this treaty. But you can see just a few years earlier, most of Idaho is still Indian Territory, including all of central and southern Idaho and Boise. So now after, the next step, of course, as we've been discussing and we know in the spoils of war, is to control food access. So in physical control, food access is key. For me and my community, the Lakota Nation and the Great Sioux Nation in the Plains, that meant the buffalo. Not only were they our primary source of food, they were our source for clothing, for housing, for all of our tools and utensils. And so it became the policy of the United States government to exterminate the buffalo. And what this meant in real terms is the United States military, the Army, helped and assisted in this goal. As we know, the United States Army set up forts throughout the United States to help physically control the Indian problem. One of them was here, Boise. Fort Boise was a precursor to the city known as Boise now. So in these forts in the Great Plains, the Army did two things. One is that they refused to implement and protect the treaty hunting rights of the tribal nations. And then two, they provided shelter to the hunting parties that came out to hunt the buffalo. The railroads were also complicit in the extermination of the buffalo. They hosted buffalo hunting parties, and they went throughout the United States with the hunting parties on top of the railroad and simply killed as many buffalo as they could. This picture here is, of course, a large picture of buffalo heads and buffalo skulls, and they were almost, in fact, entirely exterminated by the end of the 1800s, which led to very successfully requiring Native Americans to move to the reservations, otherwise they would starve to death. Here in Idaho, this tends to be more of a story about fish and controlling access to fishing rights for the indigenous population here, damming the waters in which those fish are dependent upon in order to reproduce, and not protecting the fishing and hunting treaty rights that were promised to the indigenous nations. So before we go on to mental control, what does this physical control mean, and what does it look like for me and for Native people today? Well, from a physical control perspective, Native Americans were moved to all the places non-natives didn't want to live or didn't have resources that non-natives wanted. So for the most part, tribal nations are located in the most rural, most isolated locations with the fewest natural resources. As a Native American attorney that works on economic development, this provides a whole slew of challenges that most communities don't have to face. In addition, we're faced now, as we're looking back on our own history, with the fact that all of the land and all of the resources that built the United States of America was confiscated from Native Americans, and it was forcibly reallocated to the government and to non-natives. The wealth of South Dakota, the wealth of Idaho, was built on land and natural resources confiscated from Native Americans. From a food perspective, what this means, as you can imagine, is that by forcing dependency of these indigenous nations on the federal government through food control, what was allocated to them tended to be sugar and carbohydrates. And so it developed very poor eating habits within the Native communities, which has led to horrible diabetes and obesity rates that we see today. And that is playing itself out even right now with COVID. The two biggest comorbidity factors with COVID that are leading to hospitalization and death are diabetes and obesity. And this is why you're seeing your Native American communities so disproportionately impacted by COVID and other health issues. Where I live often in Rapid City, South Dakota, which is an urban area that has a lot of Lakota people living there, approximately 15%, 10 to 15% of the population is Native American, but we comprise 50% of the COVID cases. So you can see how these issues that have happened historically continue to play out today. You're also going to see this in Idaho, for example, with your tribes fighting to have access to their fishing treaty rights and making sure that that doesn't continue to be controlled from a governmental perspective, because that is what led to the situation we have today. You also will see the nomenclature of food sovereignty. You'll see a lot of food sovereignty movements within the indigenous community to grow and catch their own food and to cut this dependency that was created purposefully by the federal government. That, of course, brings us to the second component of an occupation. In order to occupy long term, after you've obtained physical control, you have to obtain mental control. And the same variables are at play here. Control over the children, the education, your religion, your language. This here is a quote from Captain Richard Pratt. "Kill the Indian, save the man." And many of you might be familiar with this. Captain Richard Pratt was a U.S. military man with the Army, and he was put in charge of creating the Carlisle Indian School, which was one of the very first Indian boarding schools run by the federal government. This was his motto. This was the motto of the Carlisle Indian School, and this became the model of all the Indian boarding schools throughout the United States. Those boarding schools started in the early 1800s, and many of them lasted well into the 1970s. In fact, one of the best known boarding schools here in Idaho was in De Smet, and that was where the Coeur d'Alene children were sent. And that boarding school was run by the Catholic nuns until 1972. This is a picture of the children at the Carlisle Indian School. I think what's interesting about this, again, in modern times, you can see how closely populated they are with one another. What this meant was that our children were particularly susceptible to viruses and other outbreaks. So we had very high mortality rates in these boarding schools with tuberculosis outbreaks, and then again in 1919 with the Spanish flu. So Native American families sort of view COVID and going back to school, I think, with a greater urgency and concern than might be true for other folks that haven't gone through these same pandemics with their children. But of course, what's particularly interesting about the boarding schools and the strategy, I always say that it was one of the most successful federal policies ever implemented. Its goal was to stop the indigenousness of the children, and therefore they were prohibited from speaking their language. They were punished for speaking their language to each other, including siblings. They were obviously prohibited from practicing their religion. They were forced to adopt Christianity and participate in Christianity. Their names were removed and they were given English names. And they were taught that everything about them was wrong. Everything about their parents and the things that they had learned at home was wrong. And in fact, their religion was the devil's religion. And even today, this continues to play out. I know I was going to an Indigenous Native ceremony a few months back, and one of the elder in my community who had been sent to the boarding schools and raised in this way was very upset with me and said that I was going to participate in a devil situation. And so you can imagine the confusion of these children going home. They no longer speak the same language as their parents. They think their parents are bad. They think everything about where they're going back home is bad. And you have multiple generations raised like this, right? This isn't just one person. This is for 100 years. So you have multiple generations that are being sent to these boarding schools and told that you're bad. You can imagine that one person in your family that has a lot of self-confidence issues, that doesn't have a lot of self-love, and the difficulties that that causes, the addiction problems, the relationship problems, and now you multiply that by not only one entire generation, but the next generation and the next generation. In addition, you have all of these children with no parenting skills because they're not being raised in their own homes. They're being raised by institutions. And this is just now ending in the 50s and 60s. Here's a really well-known photo of a Native young man before and after. And this is all over the posters and the United States pamphlets promoting how beneficial the boarding schools are to make you into this fine young Native man. So now we're going to move on to the next picture, before and after. Here you have a woman in her regalia, her traditional outfit before, and here she is, of course, in her Christian outfit with her younger sister. This is either at a baptism or a first communion. So what does this mean for folks like myself, for other Native people in the United States? Well, you can imagine you've got entire generations of kids that were raised thinking that there's nothing good about them, of who they are or their family. And you can imagine the difficult work that we're doing to break those cycles within our own communities. This is compounded by the difficult fact that you can imagine the types of individuals back in the 1800s and early 1900s that were willing to move to the middle of nowhere, extremely rural Indian reservations, to work with children with little oversight. The physical and sexual abuse was rampant at the boarding schools. And so this now becomes learned behavior for those children as well. This next picture is my own grandmother. The picture before this, I'm going to go back, is my mother's grandmother in this before and after photo. This is my grandmother. This is my mother's mother. She was sent to the boarding schools in South Dakota. And she got married when she was 15 years old in order to escape that boarding school. By the time she was 20, she had 5 small children, including my mother, who was born there on the reservation in South Dakota. The South Dakota boarding school system was very effective at its job with my grandmother. It completely fissured her relationship with the language and with Lakota spirituality. She moved her family to Idaho, and that is why my mother ended up graduating at Pratt High School. It is just now with my generation that we are starting to reclaim our language. Malakota, Heather Dawn Thompson, Naish Toshunke Imachiapi, Wakpa Washteo Yanke Hematahan. That we are beginning to practice Lakota spirituality, that we are growing our children's hair long and teaching them to be proud of who they are despite the teasing. So that is what this history of mental control meant for us today and how we overcome that. And so that brings us now full circle to the same question that we asked during the first exercise. What would you do? And what would these Native American families do? Were they supposed to fight? We saw the results of that at Wounded Knee and all these battles. Those families were terminated. They no longer have children. They no longer have a line. Do you try and hide? Many tried that. That was also not successful. They were found. Their food sources were cut off and they were returned to the reservations. Do you acquiesce? Do you just let your children be taken to the boarding schools despite all your best thoughts and knowing that they probably won't return because of the high mortality rates? Do you learn to speak English? Do you go to church and practice Christianity? But what about in the future? In 10 years or 50 years or even 100 years? Do you want them to just get over it? Or do you want them to remember that they are Lakota, to speak Lakota, to practice Indigenous religions? Do you forever resist? And so as we come to the conclusion of this hypothetical scenario, as well as a discussion of more real scenario, I'll put some more words up here for your consideration. Treaty rights, language restoration, sovereignty. So this begs the question. The next time you see the lingering effects of forced government dependency, when you're watching television and you see that young Native man do anything he can to protest and stop that oil pipeline from going through his last remaining piece of land. When you hear about the tribe fighting all the way to the Supreme Court to protect their treaty fishing rights so that they can have unfettered access to food sovereignty. When that grandmother, that elderly grandmother, comes to your school board meeting over and over again and keeps asking for Native history to be included in your curriculum. When the 5 tribes that you still have in Idaho come to you and ask to be heard, they ask for a seat at the table. When they're asking for representation in your governor's office, when you have this historic moment, when you have 2 Native Americans running for federal office, Rudy Soto running for Congress and Paulette Jordan running for Senate, I hope you're able to pause and, as women leaders, find that empathy, bring that to the table, and no longer ask yourself the hypothetical, what would you do? But now ask yourself, what will you do? Thank you so much for having me here at Boise State University, providing me the opportunity to speak to my family in Idaho and to you at the Women and Leadership Conference. I hope the rest of your conference goes wonderfully, and I look forward to answering your questions live after this. Thank you.
Hi. All right. Well, I'm excited to be here with Heather Dawn Thompson. It's been a pleasure to watch and participate from the sidelines on your keynote and to be able to help facilitate our Q&A, our live Q&A as part of the Women in Leadership Conference hosted by the Andrus Center for Public Policy, I think that lives in the Boise State University campus. I am speaking with you today from Nimipu territory. I am a citizen of the Nimipu Nation. My name is Tai Simpson. Inem Winitwa Satitwatit. My name is the Storyteller. Heather, it is such an honor to be a part of this with you. I know that we have a limited amount of time, so I'll skip a lot of the introduction piece and just allow you a quick reintroduction live, and then we'll go from there.
Great. Thank you, Tai. I'm so honored to be with you today. I see we have 600 plus people on the Zoom world with us on the internet today. I'm happy to be broadcasting in Boise. I want to say hi to my family that's watching in Boise and Pratt, and delighted that we've been watching your comments as we watch the video, and some really interesting and impactful comments. So we really look forward to your questions.
Fantastic. Well, we'll get started with one of the more poignant questions that came in. I know that there was some discussion of physical control in Indian country, and I should say that I'll use Indian country, Native, and Indigenous rather interchangeably. So just keeping that in mind. So I know that you know, Heather, but for the folks who are learning today. So in Indian country, physical aspects of control, displacement, and also what correlates to that is the psychological piece that came with losing our land. So how do you think those two things are interrelated? And, what part do they play in the way that we function as communities now?
It's such a good question and such a complex one. But I think we all know, if you don't have control over your own body and your own physical decisions, how that impacts your hopelessness as an individual person. And so if you can imagine that amplified by your entire family, your entire community, your entire tribe, what that would impact from your faith in the system, your faith in your people around you, your faith in the ability to have any impact today in modernity as we're growing, those emotional scars are lasting. And we see that in the low voting participation rates. We see that in hopelessness on a larger epidemic scale. And so I think that physical control has long-lasting scarring emotional effects.
Oh, thank you for that. And that resonates quite a bit, right? Like, especially when we have to, lean into the adage of walking in two worlds, right? Holding on to our language and our culture, while at the same time code switching into colonization and Western white academia as we know it. And being able to navigate in both of those spaces is exhausting, as I'm sure you all know. I also, I found one of these questions rather interesting in discussing like what are the biggest roadblocks to Indigenous self-determination or Indigenous sovereignty. Let's focus on kind of those political roadblocks more than anything.
Sure. This is a relatively complex answer, but we have a very sophisticated, educated audience listening to us today. But the main roadblock we have is full territorial jurisdiction. I would argue that everything is intertwined with that. And what does that mean? That means this is something that comes totally naturally to the average American. If you are in Idaho and you drive across the border to Utah, you're under Utah's rules. Pretty simple. You know who's in charge. That's Utah's tax laws. That's Utah's criminal justice laws. That's Utah's civil jurisdiction as well. It's not true in Indian country. It is dependent upon who owns the piece of land. So if that land is native owned or non-native owned, depends on whether you yourself are an enrolled tribal member or the other person is native or non-native. And so it's complete insanity. You can't run a nation. You can't run a criminal justice system. You can't run economic development if you don't have clear rules. This is how I make my money as a lawyer, because the answer to every single question on doing business with an Indian tribe, on working on an Indian reservation, on whether or not a crime was committed on an Indian reservation? The answer is it depends. And that's going to give you 2 to 3 weeks worth of work for me to give you the answer. And I'll give you one real specific example. As a federal prosecutor on the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation in my previous life, I had to figure out whether or not that bar fight was on Indian land or non-Indian land, whether or not the people who were fighting were Indian, non-Indian, and whether or not the crime was a misdemeanor or a felony. And depending upon each of those different variables, either the tribe prosecuted it, the state prosecuted it, or the federal government prosecuted it. And that is an impossible way to secure a community and make sure that it's safe. And this exact same situation and analysis applies with economic development. So if you're a business, are you going to go on the Nez Perce Reservation when you have to go through that complex analysis of who taxes you, who you pay, regulatory heed to, et cetera, or are you going to go downtown Boise? Yeah. And until this country has the strength to restore full tribal jurisdiction, just like it does to Utah, Idaho, et cetera, Boise, then we as nations will never have full self-determination or be successful economically or in any other way.
Oh, and even to the same token, I mean, I'm going to draw a parallel there into my work, right? Where we're looking at, how Indigenous nations have these complicated jurisdictional and criminal justice systems when we are pursuing solutions around violence in Native American communities, specifically the missing and murdered Indigenous women's epidemic. Who was the perpetrator? Who was the victim? Was that victim a member of the tribe on the reservation that the crime took place? Did it take place off the reservation? So I very, very often have to, discuss these really complicated issues around jurisdiction and sovereignty, that sort of thing. So thank you for answering that question. There's one that I find really interesting that a couple of folks have asked in the chat box is what implementations can be made in some of our systems, particularly the education system, elementary children, all the way into secondary school, to create more knowledge about this history and even create more knowledge about what we can do to cultivate leaders into the future.
It's such an interesting question right now in today's time and age where we're having these really difficult discussions as a nation. These really basic concepts about different perspectives are just simply not taught in our education system, whether it be the African American perspective, whether it be the Hispanic American perspective, the Native American perspective. We pride ourselves on being this melting pot, and it's one of the most important threads of our fabric as a nation. But we only tell the story from one of those threads. And so it's real difficult to appreciate the full fabric of our nation if we don't honor and incorporate all of those different perspectives into our history. And so I am not a professional educator, but I have always deeply felt that the number one solution is incorporating these concepts into our elementary education system. This semester, because of COVID, I have been fighting as a mother in my own school district for this incorporation of Lakota and Indigenous people's history in particular, and it's just not happening. And so this is the first opportunity that we've ever had as parents in my area to go virtual and to pick an option that's different than what's being offered locally. So we have actually removed all of our Indigenous children from our school system and have enrolled them in a different online school system that incorporates more voices into that. So for all those educators out there, bless you, and please do start to better incorporate these concepts and these ideas into that.
What time better than now to really change the way that we view education? I mean, it's the time now where we can really incorporate our cultural knowledge into these education systems. Like we can play such a proactive role in the way our children engage in new knowledge because we don't know what education looks like in the face of a pandemic. So that's really great. I love to hear that. And I also love to hear the stories out of some of these central United States reservation schools that have immersion schools for language. Like Lakota is actually taught to y'all at a very young age. I had to learn mine over the course of my lifetime and still will be forever learning. So that's actually a really great way to, lean into cultural rejuvenation. And that was even another question that folks have asked. And I'm going to combine a couple of different ones for the sake of time, but I think it's a pertinent question. What role does cultural rejuvenation or even language revitalization play in your role as a leader in your community, in your role as a lawyer? I mean, and even in the big picture for our tribal communities, what is that cultural rejuvenation and revitalization play for communities as a whole?
Yeah, I know it's such an important question. And I just wanted to note, I do see that there's a whole bunch of questions in the chat that we probably won't get to. So when we're done at 4:30, I'll take a moment before I move on and I'll try and answer some of those in chat the best I can. This is a uniquely difficult question for a woman as a lawyer, because you're in a really unique position. I have one of the best, arguably, Western educations in my community. And I have to tread lightly to make sure I don't run over the best Indigenous education in our community.
Absolutely.
And so my job is at least the way I view my job is to listen to the Indigenous experts and translate that as best I can into the Western legal world that I've been tasked with within my community. And so I'll give you a couple specific examples of what that might look like. As a lawyer, you write a lot of contracts and you have to put rules in there about what you do if the contract is broken. And usually it's go to this court, under this state, under this law. And for my clients, I try to put in Indigenous perspectives on conflict resolution. We will try to resolve this first. We will go to these elders and get their expertise on how we might come about this in a better way than going into litigation, which is a completely different perspective than Western litigation, and oftentimes absolutely blows the other attorney's mind, and they really have to think about it and takes them 2 or 3 weeks to agree to it. But that's indigenizing and incorporating Indigenous knowledge into this new Western world and Western knowledge that we're working on. Another example is I have a client that is a tribal-owned corporation, which is a whole nother conversation, but tribes don't have a tax base. So in order to run their government, they have to make money by participating in the private marketplace. They own casinos and gas stations and hotels, et cetera. That's their revenue. But this tribal corporation, they didn't want to do it completely Western. We did it where the heads of the family, the different families on the reservation, are the board. Those are the decision makers. And, every time we sign a contract, everybody's like, what is that? And it takes you an extra 2 days to walk through how the process works. But that's putting Indigenous values into a Western structure. So there's a couple examples, Tai.
No, that's great. It's, again, walking two worlds, right? We always have to carry our indigeneity with us while walking in these spaces of Western and settler colonialism. And it can be very complicated. Some folks are asking really great questions about the intersections of violence in Native American communities, in addition to the jurisdiction and sovereignty issue. That's actually something that I hold very near and dear to my heart and something I work very specifically on. So I can also help you answer some of those questions when we move after.
Yeah, why don't you take that one, Tai? I know you've been working on missing and murdered Indigenous women quite extensively.
Rather extensively. It's the life's work for now. I did want to move into, because we are, folks came here and participating in this conference to understand our role in public policy, our role as women leaders. What can we do to set the example for modeling Indigenous, I guess I would call them Indigenous philosophies as leaders? Like, what could that look like for some of these non-Native participants today? Like, what could they do as audience members to improve the way that they communicate and interact with Native American communities?
Well, I think there's two components to your question. One is the public policy implications and how do we incorporate these things into public policy? And then the other is sort of from a personal perspective. How do you better communicate with your Indigenous populations? Let me tackle the public policy one first, if that's okay, Tai, because
Absolutely.
that is sort of the framework with which we're operating in here today at BSU. The Native American population, as is true of many other minority populations in the United States, is not large enough to have a political impact through the democratic structure that the United States has set up. In some areas, we're 20% of the population, like in Arizona and New Mexico, Alaska. But in other states, I haven't looked at Idaho, but my guess is you're probably closer to 5%.
Yeah, like 5-6%. You're right.
Yeah.
And so in some areas, in some counties, you can have an impact on your county board and things like that. But if you look at the overall picture, you can have a very small impact. And so these issues that we're talking about today, whether they be Native issues or other issues, they have no chance in the federal government or the state government unless you as non-Native people participate with us.
Yep.
Absolutely no chance.
Absolutely.
And so we can't have our voices heard unless we have your voices with us, period. Half of my profession is serving as an advocate in the federal government. And we're just too small of a population, and we don't have the money either to make the huge political contributions to have any impact. So if I could leave you with any one thing, it's to please educate yourself on the modern policy issues that are of importance to your Indigenous communities today. The treaty rights, the fishing treaty rights, the missing, murdered Indigenous women issue that comes a lot from the criminal jurisdictional issues. It is easy to be offended by blatantly racist situations, right? Like we can all agree certain things shouldn't be happening. It is harder to participate and stop insidious little changes on a daily basis. And it's even harder to become actively, so not just say, oh, that's bad, but actively say, oh, this is good. This needs to change. Support hard things. It is a hard thing to support tribal treaty rights for fishing when you're not Native. It is a hard thing to support restoration of criminal jurisdiction to that tribe so that they can protect their own people when it's not your community and you don't live there. But it will never, ever happen without you.
Yeah, absolutely amazing answer. And I love that you approached it from the public policy standpoint. In recent months, we had some work taking place in Idaho around public policy development and advocacy. And what's really interesting to me, so collectively, the 5 federally recognized tribes that have territory in Idaho make up like $39 billion worth of tax revenue billion with an M, tax revenue in the state of Idaho. Like that's nothing to really scoff at as far as collective economic power goes in the state. So really, and that my tribe, for example, is the second largest employer in the Lewis and Clark Valley of Idaho. So really leaning on those things, like we are doing our best as Indigenous nations to empower and build community around us, but are not receiving the same support in a reciprocated and healthy way. And that applies for policy, that applies for access to healthcare and education. It just applies to being good neighbors and being good stewards of the land that we're all on. So it's a really interesting place for us to really start to lean into one another. Like, how do we move forward from here? And let's even let's go ahead and try to finish up with that question. I'm just again trying to be really mindful of time for y'all. If there's one or two things, and I really hate the checklist model, I'm going to be really transparent in that. If there's one or two things that our colleagues and co-conspirators on the Keynote Live with us could take away and do to, even, let's see what you said, indigenize, like even I lean into learning Indigenousness about criminal justice. Like what sort of things would you encourage them to do to learn more about who our communities are?
Sure. I see a lot of folks posting in the comments, watch Apache 8 and watch Indian Horse. And those are great. It's certainly a start. And there's a lot of truth to those stories. And someone said they had learned in watching Apache 8 about how they had taken the girls away when they were 8 years old and sent them to essentially what became a modern boarding school when you were sent to white families, non-Native families, to learn how to speak English and become more American. So you can learn a lot from those documentaries. You can find them on Netflix. It's safe in your own home. It's not so scary going to, classes and things like that. But you can find a lot on YouTube and on the internet to educate yourself. But I would also try and find a happy place from what you already do, right? If you are in education, then you can help by incorporating these things into your curriculum. If you are already an attorney, you can help bring these equity issues and these jurisdiction issues into your practice. If you are in economic development or you are in private practice, a purchaser, you can do business with tribal governments. As I said, they have no tax base. So buying from their companies, holding your conferences at their hotels, that is the income for those people, for that nation. If you are in the environmental area, if you're a scientist, incorporate Indigenous ideas. I think we're seeing this now with the fires, right? The California tribes have been saying for a long time, you need to do these things. I think there's sort of this mystery around Indigenous environmentalism, that somehow it's mystical or magical and it's untouchable and we can't understand it. But anybody who is a farmer, anybody who camps a lot, an outdoorsman, a fisher person, a gardener, or gardeners, you have a different relationship with the earth.
Mm-hmm.
You're out there with the animals, you're out there with the earth, you understand how much you impact the earth. And so I know we're running out of time. I think we have probably one more question, but I did want to incorporate this into this answer, into this conversation. It's a change in mindset. It's really an incorporation of a different worldview. And in Lakota, I'm sure every culture has its name for it. We call it mitakuye oyasi, which means we are all related. And it's a completely different way of looking about how you live your life and you do your job every day. How does what I'm about to do, this decision I'm about to make, this food I'm about to waste, this thing I'm about to do, how does it affect the other humans around me,
Mm-hmm.
the other animals around me, and the earth around me? And we're starting to see these implications today in the fires and everything else around us.
Absolutely.
And so it's a day-to-day decision making. If you can do anything, if you can just better incorporate that concept into your daily life, your personal decisions and your professional decisions, how are we all related and how does this affect everything else around me? It's a completely different way of looking at things. And I remember when everything was going on with the No DAPL movement in North Dakota, there was a congresswoman's wife who said that all the animals and the resources that were on the earth were put there biblically for man to use however they so choose, and therefore this was not an issue or a concern. And I don't know that everybody who practices Christianity believes that, but that struck me really strongly. Like, it's just a completely different way of looking at the world. And if you really want to incorporate an Indigenous perspective, that's one thing that all Indigenous communities share. How do we all affect one another? And it's a very circular rather than, it's a very circular perspective. And that's how you incorporate Indigenous perspectives.
Absolutely. Oh, that's such a great way to finish. And I'll even draw the parallel for folks. One of the key things I want you to take away from today, Heather and I are both Indigenous women. We have a shared experience, but not necessarily a shared vision. There is a lot of diversity across Indian country, across Indigenous nations. Our languages are different. If you notice, my introduction and Heather's did not sound the same. They're two different languages. Our land base is different. So the way that we would approach our leadership as Indigenous women is going to be different. So keep that in mind. We're not monoliths. And even to draw the parallel then back to we are all related. My tribe, we focus on protecting the sacred, giving back to the community, and keeping nature in balance. We say Witaspa and Himuma and Wayakin, right? So those are our words for that as well. So we have just a couple of more minutes. Do you have any pressing closing reflections, anything that you would love for folks to take away in these last 1 to 2 minutes with us?
I'm looking at our notes from the questions that we had before. I think, just coming back to those two themes, like we said, we're all related. Each Indigenous community has a different way of thinking about it or saying it, but it's all the same thing about how we can be better neighbors, how we can take care of each other better as a community. And we haven't been doing that particularly well as a nation. And I think we as women are uniquely situated for this leadership, to have better empathy for each other, to think more about how we affect each other, and to bring the decision makers in our community along those lines. Because if we are going to survive together as a nation for thousands of years, we've got to do better by each other, and better by our communities, and better by our environment. So those would be the thoughts that I'd like to leave with. Absolutely.
Thank you so much. I think that's a great place for us to stop. It's been a pleasure and an honor to facilitate with you today, Heather Dawn. You have been one of my like on the fringes. I fangirl on the fringes. Eventually I'll go to law school and follow your breadcrumbs, I hope. Thank you all so much for being with us today. Again, I dropped my email somewhere in here. If you have violence in Indian country questions I can answer for you. I will kind of look at some of these questions, and if they are relevant to my work, I'm happy to answer them for you as well. I will drop my email one more time, and then hopefully I'll see some of you in my skill builder tomorrow.
Thank you, Tai. Thank you, everybody. I'll go on the chat now and answer some questions.